الأشياء الأساسية رح ناخد فيها introduction to the biomedical ethics. Then we will be talking about the mechanism of research reviewing and monitoring. And then we'll talk a little bit about incidents of misconduct. نبتدي أولا. Biomedical ethics started after World War II. And the main impact for it was due to the different violations that happened during the Nazi experiment. What happened with during the war, that the war was being conducted in areas with cold weather, with freezing temperatures and so on. So the army, the Nazi army, tried to see what are the physiological response of the body to freezing so they can avoid it for their soldiers. So they started doing freezing experiments on living persons, which led to death of several of them. One of the most infamous physicians during the Nazi era was Joseph Mengele. Joseph Mengele was known as the angel of death, and he used prisoners in the concentration camps for medical experimentation. Now, one of the experimentations was horrifying because he infected one twin with a germ, and the other twin was not expecting that the twins have identical immunological system. So he sacrificed both human twins to see the difference in their body, in their organs, between the infected and non-infected at autopsy. So this was one of the, of course, they came after the defeat of Germany. They came to a trial in Nuremberg, and many physicians and healthcare workers were tried, and some of them were also executed because of their crimes. It came to the principles, what was called the first trial, the first attempt to do certain codes for experimentation on humans was the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code insisted that there should be a voluntary consent, and the experiment should yield fruitful results for the good of the society, and the experiment should be designed after it had been tested on animals and with knowledge of the natural history of the problem that is being studied, and that the experiment should be conducted to avoid unnecessary and mental suffering or injury for the participants in the experiment. And no experiment should be conducted that will lead to death or disability. There are 10, we are going one by one. The 6th was the degree of risk should never exceed that determined by the assessment of the humanitarian importance of the problem to be solved by the experiment, and that there should be proper preparation to protect the subjects. Now we call the subjects participants, because subject is some kind humiliating kind of terminology. The experiment should be conducted by a scientifically qualified person, and the subject has the right to withdraw at any time, and the investigator must be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage in order to protect the safety of the subjects. Now, one of the also very famous or infamous type of experiments conducted in the States was the syphilis study. This is pertinent at this time where people are demonstrating for the rights of the Black population. What happened is that in Macon County in the Mississippi state, there was a small town that's called Tuskegee, and in that town there were farmers, black farmers. Most of them were infected with syphilis. At that time, there was no effective treatment for syphilis. Most of the treatments that was used was based on either arsenic or mercury, and both of them were toxic. And there were theories that the late effects of syphilis infection were due to treatment more than the infection itself. So they tried to see what was the natural history of syphilis during, if untreated. So they selected those people who were infected. They told them, we are treating you for bad blood. So there was some deception about it. And they took all the tests they can do. They took blood tests, they took x-rays, they even took lumbar puncture of all of those patients. They used with them also a black nurse in order to relate to the people, so they are trusting the experiment that was going. Well, the experiment started in the, even before the World War II, in the 30s. However, it was continued even after the Nuremberg Code was established. Nuremberg Code was established in 1946, and this was not discovered, and it was accidentally actually discovered by the press in 1970. And so they, when it leaked to the press, and there was a very strong opposition to it, it was stopped. But it was going on, although penicillin was specific for treatment of syphilis in 1952. Between 1952 and 1970, they continued to follow those patients without treatment, and they all went into tertiary syphilis with all its complications. Now, the Declaration of Helsinki followed by the World Medical Assembly that the mission of the physician should safeguard the health of the people, and their actions should, their knowledge and conscience should be to fulfill that mission. Then in 1979, the Belmont Report followed the 3 basic ethical principles that were suggested by Beaumont and Childress in their famous book, their original book on biomedical ethics, that there should be 3 elements: the respect for persons, which is called the autonomy, the beneficence and non-maleficence, la darara wa la dirar, which is to minimize the risk, and justice, that the burdens and benefits of research are equitably distributed, that you shouldn't be testing things on a certain population for the benefit of a totally different population. And the Belmont Report set the boundaries between practice and research. Of course, most of the research is done by physicians. Their main charge is to treat people. However, during their treatment, they might be interested to see whether their treatment is correct, whether the effect of their treatment is doing what it's supposed to do. So there is always a mixture between practice and research. The Belmont Report decided that practice, defined as the interventions designed to solely benefit a certain patient. We draw blood. We draw blood to see, for example, the sugar level. And that sugar level, we are using it in order to set the treatment for that person with diabetes. That is practice. Research is an activity designed to test a hypothesis, to draw conclusions, and to develop generalizable knowledge, that we can transfer that knowledge from one person to another. We take, let's say, for example, 100 patients with diabetes. We test their nerve conduction study. We decide the prevalence of peripheral neuropathy in patients with diabetes. So that knowledge, let's say if we have 50% with peripheral neuropathy, we say that any patient with diabetes has a 50% chance of developing peripheral neuropathy. So that is a transferable or generalizable knowledge. I'm sorry. Okay. The applications of Belmont Report insisted on that there should be informed consent, there should be assessment for the risk and benefit ratio in any kind of research, and that the selection of the subjects for research should be equitable, should be scientifically valid, and also should be socially justifiable. That number one, we select the subjects not because they are available, because they are pertinent to the subject that we are trying to test. That the selection criteria, if we are studying diabetes, we study all, the selection criteria is all the patients with diabetes, not only, for example, we go to a prison institute and see how many patients with diabetes. We are selecting a certain populations that is vulnerable, let's say. Now we come back to a definition of research. What is a research? Research is defined as any systematic investigation designed in whole or part to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. And we mentioned that in the Belmont Report, that it is the knowledge that we extract from our project that we can apply to a certain population that is uninvolved in that research, but fulfill the criteria that we selected the research population for. Now, investigation includes generating, gathering, and analysis of information. So anything that comes under this definition is considered a research. Now, what is the benefit of research? Because we need to define the benefit of research in order to say, okay, we are dealing with the benefit and risk ratio. The benefits are the health-related, psychosocial, or other value to the individual participant, or something that will contribute to acquisition of generalizable, worthwhile knowledge. So the benefit can be either to the person participating in the research himself or the research subject, or something that will contribute to the knowledge that will benefit the society. These are the benefits of research. Now, an exception here, money or other compensation for participation is not considered a benefit in the research. As a matter of fact, it is just a compensation for research-related losses, such as inconvenience, such as money that the person has to pay for transporting to the research center, money that the patient has to take off his job in order to come and have tests done for the research and so on. And actually, if excessive compensation is being used, it may be considered coercive or trying to twist the mind of the person in order to participate, and therefore it is considered unethical. Now, of course, the law in Saudi Arabia had been approved by a royal decree, that the law of research on living subjects, whether it is humans or animals or even plants and so on. It was approved on the 13th of Ramadan, 1431. Now, the policies for application of the law were compiled by the National Committee of Bioethics, and it was issued by the president of King Abdulaziz City for Science and Technology on the 29th of Muharram, 1433, and the first edition cover is seen on the right-hand side. What is the purpose of the law? The law is to protect the rights of humans or any part of a human subject, and to guarantee the safety of humans, and to maintain the respect and dignity of research subjects, and to avoid causing any harm to animals or plant or environment in the conduct of the research. Why do human research subjects need protection? Ethical principles are, as I mentioned, as was approved by the Belmont Report, beneficence and non-maleficence, al-adam al-idrar. So it is promotion of the well-being and to maximize the benefits and minimize the harm that is associated with the research. And respect for the person. Each person is a respectful individual that has his autonomy, that he can decide to himself, and the information that he gives during the course of the subject should be kept private and not to be leaked to any other area. And important areas that people do not like for their information to be leaked are insurance companies, for example, that they don't, if they are being subjects for testing for a certain disease, they don't want the insurance companies to raise their premium because of that, or the employer may dismiss him from work if he knows that he has, for example, cancer or whatever. And then justice and fairness in conducting the research, where the selection of subjects and the benefits of the research should be of the same human group. Who are responsible for the safety in the research? Number one, the investigator himself is responsible. The sponsors of the research, be it a pharmaceutical company, be it a research center, and so on. The institutions that conduct the research is also responsible for the safety. The local committee oversees the safety of the research subjects, and the National Committee of Bioethics supervises all the above. The Article 3 of the law says that it is not permissible for any institute to conduct research on living things unless it registers a local research ethics committee that grants permission to conduct research and monitors adherence to the research ethics in accordance to the law and regulations. So that makes it a violation of the law that is can be punishable if research is done in an institute that does not have a registered local research ethics committee. Now, each establishment doing research shall form a local committee consisting of at least 5 members. This is Article 10 of the law, and the regulations will determine the manner of forming the said committee, as well as the provisions and rules governing its activities. And the committee shall especially, but not exclusively, do the following. Number one, the two pillars of the responsibility are based on the independence and monitoring the research, and safeguarding the rights and safety and well-being of the trial participants, with special attention to the vulnerable subjects. Now, we define vulnerable subjects as al-mustad'afin. Let's take, for example, pediatric population, those who cannot consent for themselves. They are vulnerable. Let's take prisoners. They lost their freedom, so they can be forced to participate in, or they can be thought of as being subjects that can be forced for participating in research that they don't want. These require extra caution and extra protection by the Research Ethics Committee, the elderly being weaker population in the community, and they may have special needs that they should be looked after. Or people with limited comprehension, such as children with cognitive disabilities. Now, the local committee should be registered with the National Committee of Bioethics. The National Committee requires the following information. Number one, simply the name and location of the institute. This is an institute that is at the Saudi Council for Health Specialties and so on. It should be defined as such. Dating the request. What is the nature of research conducted by that institute? Is it epidemiological research? Is it interventional research? Is it cancer treatment research, and so on? And then the names of the chairman of the committee and its members and their curricula. Each one should have a curriculum vitae that shows that he is a knowledgeable person. What is the aim of the local ethics committee? It's to protect the research subjects and to make sure that they are not exposed to unnecessary harm or risk, and also to protect the investigators and co-investigators carrying out the research, and to ensure that vulnerable groups are not abused in research conduction, and to guarantee the safety of the research and all the participants in the research. What are the duties of the local ethics committee? Number one duty is to approve the research projects from ethical standpoint. Now, of course, trying to say that a research is ethical will depend on its scientific value. Research of low scientific value is not ethical to be conducted. That's why the ethics committee may look at scientific evaluation of any project in order to say, okay, yes, this is scientifically valid and will give information that will benefit the practice of taking care of people. To ensure that the research is compliant with the law and the policies that are printed and distributed by the National Committee of Bioethics, and to ensure the validity of the procedures of obtaining informed consent, that the informed consent is not just a signed piece of paper. Informed consent has two parts. Number one, informed. So we should determine that the person who is participating is well informed about the project, its purposes, its risks, what he can expect, and what he should be able to leave the project if he wants to any circumstances that would lead him to. And then to perform periodic follow-up on the research projects to make sure that the researcher is compliant with what he had set forth in the research project that was approved. It is not of value to approve a certain project and then the investigator will take that approval as a carte blanche to do anything that he wants. He should follow his own regulations. And to monitor the well-being of the human subjects to prevent any harm. And this is in the policies, article number 10.1. And to coordinate with the monitoring office at King Abdulaziz City for Science and Technology. The duties of the local ethics committee to make sure that the research conforms to the applicable laws in the kingdom, and to verify the validity of the informed consent procedure, and to issue approval to conduct the research from an ethical standpoint, and to monitor the research implementation on periodic basis, and to monitor the health condition of the human subjects, and to coordinate with the monitoring office with regard to the relevant activities. Now, The membership of the local ethics committee, as by the regulations, should be at least 5 members. And an odd number was selected in order to make sure that we have always a simple majority when there is, or at least a simple majority, 3 out of 5, or 6 out, or 4 out of 7, and so on. The committee chairman or his deputy should be of Saudi nationality with experience with the biological research, and the number of members shall be determined according to the volume and type of research to be expected to be reviewed in that institution. Now, members shall be of different specialization, and when named, the following should be observed. Number one at least should be interested in the main research field of that institute. Let's say there is a research institute that mainly does research on cancer. At least one member is interested and knowledgeable about research in cancer. One should be from outside the institute, and from outside the institute that he is representing the community. It is not a closed that looks at things from scientific and not from the interest of the community, because research, after all, is a service to the community. So the community member should fulfill the following. Number one, he should have no business relation or direct interest with the institute. He shouldn't be employed by the institute. He shouldn't be paid by the institute, and have an acceptable level of education where he can understand what research is and he can vote for or against any research project. One member should have an interest in biomedical ethics, and one should have adequate knowledge in research design and statistical analysis to know whether the projects that are being brought to the committee, whether they are valid from scientific standpoint. And one should be familiar with the customs and traditions and values of the Saudi society. Now, we know that members of the committee cannot be experts in everything, and sometimes the expert in that subject is only the principal investigator. Members can be invited to the committee in order to discuss a certain project, especially if it is a highly scientific project. The expert and consultants can attend the meeting, but they don't vote. They can explain to the members of the committee the nuances of the project that they have. If the research subject is from a vulnerable group, there should be invited a specialist with experience in this field. Let's say that there is a research subject that will be done on prisoners. Now, there should be someone who is an expert in the prison societies, in the life of the patients, or not patients, inmates in prisons and so on, and what are their social needs and what are their health needs. Which research requires the local ethics committee approval? The research involving any living human subject, research involving any biological material or human embryos, the reproductive material or stem cells, and all materials derived from living or deceased humans, such as autopsies, such as amputated limbs, such as organs that are extracted during surgery. All of these need to have, if research is being conducted on them, they should be reviewed and approved by the local committee. Now, when the investigator signs the proposal, what is the meaning of that signature when it is submitted to the committee? It means that all the steps that he described in his project and that the committee will approve he should follow them to the letter, and that he should be getting the informed consent properly obtained as was approved by the committee. So the proposal is a legal document that can be held against any violators if they don't follow their project or if they don't get the informed consent as approved by the local committee. Now, the local committee can do what we call expedited review. Expedited review, if the project carries not more than the minimal risk, and the minimal risk is defined as the risk that one may be subject to in normal life, like the proportion of that the probability of being hit by a car while he is crossing the street, or that he will fall off a ladder if he is climbing a ladder, and so on. These are low enough risks that can be considered as a minimal risk. If there is a project that was approved and the PI wants to make minor modification for the project, and we'll see what are the minor modifications. Now, expedited review, he takes the project, the chairman of the committee will review it or ask one member to review it outside the meeting. And then if it is approved by expedited, if it fulfills the criteria for expedited review, he will approve of it and then goes to the committee in the next regular meeting and tell them that we approved this project based on this and that. Now, rarely the committee may overrule this and withdraw the approval pending the full review or modification of the expedited review. But that is something that is being put in the regulations in order to facilitate review. Now, when we talked about minor modification, we don't consider a minor modification if we change the dose that is being given to the patient to a higher dose, or if we add a drug, or if we add a device, or if we add an invasive procedure, or if we change the inclusion-exclusion criteria, or if we include vulnerable subjects. All of these are not minor modifications. Once a project is approved and then the PI wants to add one of these things, then it has to come back for a full review. Now, examples for expedited review, we have a drug that is registered and it is being used its own indication. So we want to see, that's what we call a phase 4. We want to see if it is doing the same in our population, if they are benefiting the same of, let's say, a drug that is given for reducing blood sugar and so on. Or collecting biological specimen non-invasively, like we want to test saliva, we want to test urine, we want to test clips of nails and try to see the prevalence of heavy metals in the nails of the population. These can be put in a project, and since it is non-invasively obtained samples, then it can be expedited review. Data collections by non-invasive procedures, such as electrocardiograms, such as checking blood pressure by cuff, such as checking the temperature by sensors, and so on. If we are doing research on material already collected for purposes other than research, if we go into the records of a laboratory and say, okay, on a single day, let's see what is the average sodium that was done for patients who came in and got blood. Well, it was collected for patient care, but we want to see some other parameters. Some of the research that has been done also like that and was expedited in review is to see that there is blood that was given for blood donation and they take part of that blood to be tested for prevalence of hepatitis B antibody, for example. It will tell us in the normal community what is the prevalence of a certain disease. Continuous review, if a project was previously approved, can be expedited. The reviews can be expedited, and the principal investigator will be told that, okay, we accept your report on the periodic review. Now we come to the monitoring office at the King Abdulaziz City for Science and Technology, and the Article 9 of the law determined that an office, King Abdulaziz City for Science and Technology, the office is in charge of oversight of all the local ethics committee and local laboratories to ensure adherence to the policies. And its work is coordinated with the National Committee of Bioethics. Now, there are certain collection of data that is not included as a research requiring approval. Many hospitals do quality assurance and quality improvement either by questionnaires or by looking at certain key performance indicators and collect data. This collect data if it is not intended for research, if it is intended for improving the services inside that institute. This is not considered a research and does not have to go to the local ethics committee. Also, evaluation of educational programs that you are doing, for example, a symposium or you're doing a webinar, and then you collect data from participants to evaluate the program and its effectiveness. Well, that's not a research. Utilization review, such as in pharmacies. Many pharmacies look at utilization of a certain drug or class of drugs for economic purposes, for correct adherence to prescribing guidelines and so on. So these utilization reviews are not research. Outbreak investigations. This is important because this is a public health and requires a quick action to see who are the contacts of those people. Let's say meningitis broke out in a certain dormitory in a university or military barrack and so on, and you want to test all of these. This outbreak investigation is a public health important and does not require research approval. All of these, provided they are not intended for publication. Once you intend for publication, you are performing research, you are looking, because you are your intent is to look for generalizable knowledge. And once it is generalizable knowledge, it is considered research. The local ethics committee goes through a checklist in order to verify approval, that there is no violation of the Sharia law and applicable laws in the kingdom, that the potential risk is reduced to a minimum by standard operating procedures and research design and standard established procedure for therapeutic and diagnostic purposes, and to evaluate the benefits and the risks. And the research subject selection is based on understanding the research objectives and not understanding the ease of collecting data from certain population, and that the informed consent contains all the required elements, and there are about 10 required elements in every informed consent, and that plan include periodic monitoring for the safety of the human subject, and that the research plan includes measures to protect the human subject and their rights, and that appropriate measures to protect the confidentiality of the data. Now we have the privacy and we have the confidentiality. There is a difference between the two. Privacy is the information when being collected. Only information that are relevant to the research project should be looked at by the researcher or by his assistant. He shouldn't be diverging into other information that are not included in the research purposes. So he shouldn't be asking, for example, for the marital status of the person if it is not included in the project needs. This is the privacy when collecting the information. Confidentiality, once these information are collected and stored, either electronically or in a paper form, they should not be leaked to any other person other than the people who are involved in the research. Now, the definition of risk is the probability of harm or discomfort, and the minimal risk, as I mentioned before, is the probability and magnitude anticipated in the physical or even psychological harm or discomfort is not greater than those in ordinary daily life or in routine medical, dental, or psychological examination. There are several problems that we have discovered with IRB activities. Number one is lack of knowledge about the research regulations by the researcher. And unfortunately, this is very common. Some young individual who is enthusiastic, wants to do research, and he has not reviewed the regulations. He should be reviewing the regulations before he starts research. Similar to not knowing the traffic law before he drives a car. The police department will not give him a license before he takes a test in the research regulations. And actually, there is a test for research regulations that qualifies an investigator to do research. And then there is sometimes some financial interest or conflict of interest that the person wants to do a research because he will gain a certain amount of money from the sponsor. Of course, the sponsor may offer a certain compensation for the efforts and not to give high amount of compensation in order to twist the results of the research. Lack of attention to the regulations. Now here, they know the regulation, but they don't give attention to it. And sometimes there is insufficient review by the IRB. The IRB have approved the project, but does not have a good mechanism to follow it. And unplanned review of the research project. There should be a periodic review, and the periodic review can be usually either on a yearly or a 6-monthly basis, depending on the risk of the project. What is conflict of interest? Conflict of interest is a set of conditions which professional judgment concerning primary interest, welfare, and validity of the research. So there are two primary interests. Number one is to preserve the patient's welfare, and number two, preserve the validity of the data. If there is something that unduly influences any of these two interests for a secondary interest, such as financial gain, then there is a conflict of interest, and that violates the rules and should stop the research. Now we finish here by saying examples on the research misconduct. We will give some historical account, and then we'll go to the research misconduct. The first misconduct is non-compliance. The IRB recognizes that non-compliance with approved protocols may occur. It is the responsibility of the PI to notify the IRB if there is an incident that may cause the subjects to increased risk or fewer benefits, or the incident compromise the integrity of the study. And again, we have the subjects and we have the data. Both of them should be safeguarded by the principal investigator and should be supervised by the local ethics committee. Now, there is something that is called continuing noncompliance. and continuing non-compliance is an important violation that is punishable by law. It's a pattern that lack the understanding or that have disregard to the regulations, and they may compromise the integrity of the study. And when there is likelihood that this non-compliance will continue, or there is frequent incidents of minor non-compliance, then there should be, such a research should be stopped. Now, what is considered as fraud and what is considered as deceit? الغش والخداع. Fraud, الغش, which is wrongful or criminal deception intended to result in financial or personal gain, such as changing the data, fabricating the data. That's fraud. Deceit, or the action of practice of deceiving someone or concealing or misrepresenting the truth. And that is, sometimes participating subjects may be exposed to deceit that, okay, we are drawing this blood for your sake, and it is not for his sake, it is for the sake of the research. And that is very common, that the patient comes in and he thinks that the blood is being drawn for his patient care, and actually it's drawn to be participating in a research. Now, let's go for historical examples. Isaac Newton, very famous. There are claims that he adjusted the calculations to fit his observations. Mendel, also very famous, that the results of course, the first experiment that he did is about planting the peas and showing that the color changed with hybridization. The results were cleaner than what was to be expected by the experiment. Louis Pasteur, he failed in his studies. That's another violation, to say that he used a vaccine that was developed by another scientist that was his competitor. Now, another example. William Summerlin in 1974 was an immunologist in the Cancer Institute of Sloan Kettering in New York. He reported that he could transplant tissue from genetically unrelated animals without rejection. Of course, this was in the old days of transplant, and he was interested in showing that xenografts can live. But the technician in his laboratory noted that the transplanted patches were actually just a drawing on the skin with a marker, and the patches could be removed with alcohol. They were not truly growing on the skin. Now, another example. Roger Bacon. This was about 700 or 800 years ago, when the West was relying on the scientific heritage of the Islamic civilization. Roger Bacon was called Dr. Mirabilis. Dr. Mirabilis, that means the astounding teacher. He wrote a book that was called Opus Majus, Kitab al-Manazir al-Kabir. And this was actually, parts of it were taken word by word from al-Manazir, Kitab al-Manazir al-Hasan ibn al-Haytham. Actually, Roger Bacon, in spite of his fame, he was imprisoned by the Franciscan order twice because they claimed that he was disseminating the alchemy that was developed by the Arabs. Now, more recently, a neuroscientist from UK called Shovron, he was recruited to Singapore to head the National Neurological Institute. And what he did, he was given a grant to investigate genetic susceptibility, and he was found to have many violations, and he was subject to 30 charges of misconduct, that he did research without informed consent, that he was hiding information from ethics committees, that he was instructing Parkinson's disease patients to stop their drugs for doing videos to show their disease. Now, how common is research misconduct? There was a survey that was done in 2005. 1.5% of principal investigators admitted that they have falsified their results or plagiarized data, of course, that taking other people information and claiming it for themselves. 2,000 studies of Vioxx. Vioxx is no longer available. It is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, but in 2000, a study of Vioxx failed to inform the New England Journal of Medicine that several patients had heart attacks on the drug, and when that was exposed, the drug was withdrawn and the company was fined with a heavy fine because of that. An investigator by the name of Paul Cornack, he changed the patient's record to enroll in the drug trials. One patient died, and the investigator was jailed for criminally negligent homicide. Why does it happen? Why do investigators falsify their results or steal the work of others? Number one, investigators may be under pressure to publish, and some institutions have the rule, publish or perish. Now, they are looking for promotion through having a long CV and many publications. And usually, every investigator is enthusiastic about his own ideas, and he thinks the world of an idea that he has without even testing it, or when it is tested, he wants to prove himself right. And then there are the financial hopes, and there are the hopes for fame and attraction of media. And of course, media have a very good attraction when you can be visible to a large population, and lacks implementation of the ethical policies with that the local ethics committee are not very serious in implementing the regulations. And that is what is called the blinding ambition. So the definition of research misconduct in the United States, they came up with the acronym FFP. FFP is fabrication. Fabrication is making up the data. It doesn't have any basis. They're just throwing numbers or recording and reporting numbers without any basis in experimentation. Falsification is to manipulate the research material or the equipment or the purposes, or changing or omitting data. There is data being collected, but it is falsified. It is changed in order to fit somebody's own ideas, but it does not accurately represent what was found during the research. You know, let's say, for example, someone changes the sensitivity on a laboratory equipment in order to give rise to a certain parameter that he is following. Now, the P stands for person's idea, or claiming other person's idea, or in other words, what is called as plagiarism. He goes into the literature, he takes what was published, and he cuts and pastes and makes another article. And that now is very easily detected by certain software. Research misconduct does not include honest error or difference in opinion. You know, sometimes there is an error that was honest, that was not intentional, that is not misconduct. Or difference in opinion about something that will be subject to a difference in opinion. Other forms of misconduct is to fail to get ethical approval, do research without ethical approval. That's a serious misconduct. Or failing to get informed consent, or falsifying, backdating the consent. Sometimes the consent, we find that it is signed by a, by a certain signature that is not the patient's signature, or it was without date, and then it is backdated to the time that it started the research. Not declaring that I have missing data. That means that they fill the gaps, and I have come across several, unfortunately, colleagues who would fill the gaps in the data sheet in order to make it look better. Withholding results that are against the researcher or the funder's interest, that there are certain results that do not prove that a certain drug is effective. So the company that funds that research will withhold that data because it's not in their interest. Not reporting the side effects in a clinical trial. That's a serious problem because it deprives the population from knowing that a certain drug has side effects. Omitting outliers or not declaring that there are outliers. Of course, in any statistics, there are outliers. They shouldn't be omitted in order to show that the results are clean. It is part of the data collection, and there might be some outliers that will have some effect on the overall results. In publication misconduct, not reviewing the pre-existing research before conducting the research. And that is unfair for the people who are subjected to the research. We should start the research where the knowledge has ended now, not to go back and start from the beginning or reinventing the wheel. Gift authorship is another misconduct. Like if I do a research, the chairman of my department name is included in the research in order to make good relationship with him, hoping for a promotion, although he did not have anything to do with the research. Redundant publication, and we have several examples where a certain set of data that is broken into several things and then published 10 times where it doesn't require more than one publication. That is called redundant publication. Not disclosing the conflict of interest, that a person has some financial link, let's say someone is testing a drug for a company in which he has a large amount of stocks. So that is a conflict of interest. So what are the rules for authorship credit? Most respected journals want authors to fulfill all the following 3 conditions. Number 1, have substantial contribution to the conception, design, acquisition of data, or analysis and interpretation of data. And number 2, they should have contribution to drafting the article, revising it critically for important intellectual content. And number 3, final approval of the version to be published. So if all of these criteria are fulfilled by a certain person, he deserves to be a co-author. Now, let's look at some classification of misconduct, and we talked about fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. Give examples for that. Andrew Wakefield in 1998, and I think that everybody knows the results, but don't know the name of the person. He wrote an article linking autism with MMR vaccine that is given to children. And he was guilty of conflict of interest. Why? Because he received money from a lawyer that lawyer was looking for a link to the vaccine and autism, and he was highly selective in reporting his data, and he was unethical in dealing with children. So he did not have proper consent. He exploited a vulnerable population, which are children. He did not conduct the clinical trial correctly, and he linked things that are unlinked, and he had a conflict in a financial interest. James Wilson, also that was in 1999, and that was an incident that stopped gene therapy for several years because he was the president and a 30% shareholder in a company called Genova. And they to replace to replace the gene of ornithine transcarbamylase, and that causes renal failure in adults, by replacing that gene by a gene that is carried by adenovirus. However, it caused the death of a certain participant called Jesse, and stopped the or delayed the implications of gene therapy for many years because of that. He failed to report the extent of adverse reactions during animal testing, and that led to problems with taking consent and the conduct of clinical trial, and conflict of interest, which was financial conflict of interest. This was also someone who is very interesting because he caused a lot of publicity in Korea. He said stem cells, and actually there was a stamp in his name, a Korean stamp in his name, and it shows that it was able to move people from wheelchair to running. And his name was Wang Woo-suk. And what he did, he published 2 landmark papers in Science reporting that he was able to make human embryonic stem cells from somatic cell nuclear transfer. And he had fabricated the data, and he had falsified his results. And also he obtained the human eggs for research by unethical means, including requiring female team members to super ovulate. He gave them ovid in order to ovulate and to collect their, of course, he exploited them being subordinates in his lab. He was suspended, he received a suspended prison sentence for embezzlement. So the crimes that he was accused of was fabrication, falsification, exploitation, and embezzlement. Now, finally, we are coming to the end. What do journals do for research misconduct? The least they can do is to publish an expression of concern. When the editor is concerned about an article containing fake data or possible plagiarized data, but an investigation has not reached a conclusion about this article, so they express concern. And that is the lowest level of, let's say, response. Or they can publish a correction to correct a mistake by substituting the correct information, or by asking the reader to disregard a specific part of an article. Okay, that means we refer to a retracted article. The third, which is the highest, is the retraction. When an investigation shows that the article contains fake data or had been plagiarized, it tells the reader to ignore that article completely. And that is a standard for all respectable journals. This was published in the Annals of Internal Medicine, 2006. I think by that we have reached the end of the presentation.